Hey there folks, in this one we are picking up from the huge cliffhanger I left you on in the last mystery video I did about the Skyforge. If you haven't seen that one yet, I highly recommend that you check it out because there are spoilers for that one in this one. So like I said at the end of that one, in my research about the Skyforge I stumbled into something big, and from that I formed a theory that if true would have enormous implications on the Elder Scrolls universe. So without further ado, here it is. I believe that Hircine is Lorkhan. Wow, quite a claim, right? It actually took me a while to get fully convinced of this myself, but at this point I am confident that this is true. I started down this path when I was trying to figure out how Hircine is connected to the Skyforge. Bethesda writes questlines very purposefully, so I knew from the get-go that it was no coincidence that Hircine plays a prominent role in the Companion's questline. As I kept investigating, I kept thinking they chose him for a reason, but what is that reason? I had always kinda thought that there might be a secret history between Kyne and Hircine, but nothing ever actually says what the relation between them is out loud. So I kept diving into all my sources looking for an answer. The first idea I came up with was actually that Hircine was Lorkhan and Kyne's son. But from those same thoughts I also figured, this could add up to Hircine somehow being Lorkhan as well. I really didn't put any stock in it at first, I had really just written it down to be thorough. But as I continued reading lore and investigating in-game, I kept finding things that made sense with the idea. Things that really looked like clues. So I kept at it for a while, and eventually I had seen enough, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. I tell ya, I just sat there with an open mouth and a chill running down my spine, and I didn't know what to think. The evidence was right in front of me, but it's such a huge claim that I just didn't know whether or not to believe it. So I decided that I would keep working on the Skyforge video and let this all settle in, then I'd examine this again with fresh eyes after. And after careful examination, I believe that this theory is true. I believe that Hircine is one of a few beings that are sometimes referred to as Lorkhan, Doomdrum in Aldmaris. So obviously, I've got some explaining to do. What has led me to this conclusion? I'll start by covering the parts of Elder Scrolls history that are important to understanding this theory. Then I'll explain where I think Hircine fits in. Then after that, I'll present you with the bulk of the evidence and my thought processes for this theory. I think that structure will be best because then you'll hear the whole story as a nice cohesive narrative with minimal interruptions. Then from the evidence after that, you'll kind of get the picture of how I put all of this together. If you're not super familiar with the Dawn Era, you may want to check out the video I have in the top right there because I did a very detailed breakdown of it in there. So now that we've covered all that, let's revisit the convention problem. How is it that Lorkhan was slain at the convention but was alive to fight in the War of Manifest Metaphors afterward? Well, when Trinimac shattered Lorkhan, he did more than just rip his body apart, he sundered several aspects of his being. This is something we know to be true because of the existence of the Heart of Lorkhan. But there's more than just that. In fact, Lorkhan was split into multiple beings, spirits that had no bodies. We know this to be true as well because Shezarrines and Shor are two different beings, which I'll explain more later. Let's define these beings to make sure that it's clear who I'm talking about as we go along. We'll call the pre-shattered Lorkhan Shezarr. I believe that Padome created Shezarr with the intention of him being unstable. And he did this by combining a bunch of traits that he knew would result in him being chaotic. Almost as if he had two different beings living inside him. Let's call these two different personalities within Shezarr the warrior and the trickster. When Shezarr was shattered, he split into a few beings that each maintained different amounts of those traits. We know that Shor, the Nordic depiction of Lorkhan, is somewhere in Sovngarde from Soon's dialogue. Let's stick to calling this Shor, and I believe that he maintained most of the warrior. A second large fragment remained in Mundus and maintained most of the Trickster. Another part of Shezarr's soul remained in Mundus and is reincarnated into mortals from time to time. These mortals are referred to as Shezarrines. Many fans have adopted a conception that Shezarrines are Shor incarnates, however I disagree with that. The logic for that conception is that the last Dragonborn doesn't meet Shor in Sovngarde and it's possible to sit on his throne. So many fans believe those things are the case because the last Dragonborn Dragonborn who is commonly accepted to be a Shezarrine is literally Shor. However, I disagree. I believe that Shezarrines and Shor are two separate beings that exist independently of each other, and here's why. Both Tsune and Ysgramor tell the last Dragonborn that when Alduin set his soul snare in Sovngarde, Shor told them not to engage him. Ysgramor adds that no souls have made it to the Hall of Valor since that point. However, this is an amphibole. Aren't they talking about this particular time that Alduin entered Sovngarde and started eating souls? Or do they mean the very first time that he did this, thus establishing the concept of it thousands of years ago? It's not clear because who's to say what exactly they mean by set his soul snare. But if we look around a bit, we can infer that it actually has to be the former, and here's why. There are several named NPCs in the Hall of Valor, and some of them died long after Alduin was cast adrift by the Tongues, such as Ulfgar the Unending, who we know died during the events of Morrowind's Bloodmoon DLC. So, Tsune and Ysgramor can't be referring to Alduin's first trip here because several souls have made it through to the Hall of Valor since then. So they are talking about this recent instance of Alduin coming to Sovngarde to feast on souls. And from that, we can deduce that Shor must have given this order not to engage Alduin while the last Dragonborn was living life in Mundus. So these must be two separate beings. Shezarrines are not Shor incarnates, these are two separate fragments of Shezarr. Furthermore, the NPCs do offer an explanation as to why Shor isn't here. Apparently, he left when he heard that the last Dragonborn was on the way because he is too bright for mortal eyes. So being in Shor's presence would be harmful to the last Dragonborn in some way, perhaps he'd blind them or something. So Shor is here somewhere in Sovngarde. I mean, they say he's bright, so maybe that's him up there. There are a few theories as to what Sovngarde's sky is. The most popular one is that we're looking at the sun from the other side, which could be true. I'm undecided on this, and it doesn't really matter for our purposes, but I'll throw out there maybe it's Shor. Back to Shezarrines, it's not clear if there's just one Shezarrine soul that gets reused over and over, or if there are multiple Shezarrine souls. For the former to be true, two can't exist at the same time. And if we interpret Kirkbride's list of Lorkhan's avatars as a list of Shezarrines, some of these people lived at the same time. Also, if we assume that Talos the god is indeed real and is indeed a Shezarrine, well, he and the last Dragonborn seem to exist at the same time. Though I suppose it's possible that Tiber Septim somehow left his Shezarrine soul behind when he ascended to godhood. So we're just going to leave this unresolved. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter how many Shezarrine souls there are anyway. Though when the term comes up throughout the rest of this video, I'm just going to say whatever's grammatically easier, or I'll just go by phonetic appeal or something. So when Trinimac shattered Shezarr, these are the beings that he got split into, which are all sometimes referred to as Lorkhan. I believe that Shor was immediately pulled to Sovngarde, which was either the result of something Shezarr had planned ahead of time or simply the result of Sovngarde existing. And likewise for the ones that remained in Mundus, this was either the result of something Shezarr had planned or it was something incidental. Also, while they did remain in Mundus, Trinimac's onslaught may have displaced them from Adamantine Tower. Furthermore, it's important to note that Shezarrines don't seem to have retained any of Shezarr's consciousness. But I do believe that the Trickster and Shor did indeed retain Shezarr's consciousness, which will come back later. After the deed was done, everyone at the convention took their leave and went their separate ways. Now let's try to imagine this from Kyne's perspective. She watched helplessly as her husband was torn apart, shattered, a punishment that she probably did not believe he deserved. So naturally, she was very upset. She entered a state of grief. She simply could not bask in the beauty of Mundus without her beloved Shezarr. And the Trickster saw opportunity in this. Kyne has the power to renew deceased beings into some form of new life, which is the general picture of what the Skyforge does. So in Kyne's grief, the Trickster found his way to her and told her, "It's me, I'm your husband's soul, and you can use your powers to reanimate me into a new body. Then we can be together again." Luckily, Kyne had managed to recover part of Shezarr's body, his heartless torso. But to make a new body, she needed more than that, so she found some animal parts. Once Kyne had everything she needed, she took the torso, the new parts, and the Trickster and used these renewal powers of hers to bind him to a new body. And as some of you may have guessed, the being that emerged from the ashes was the god that we now know as Hircine, Daedric Prince of the Hunt. The Trickster had successfully gotten himself a new body, but he had to keep the act up because if Kyne were to find out that he was just an incomplete form of Shezarr and mostly the Trickster part no less, then she might dump him. Or she might even try to take the life that she gave him back. And this presented him with yet another problem. If Auriel were to hear that Shezarr had survived, he and his allies would come for him. So for everything to work out for Hircine, he needed to eliminate Auriel and replace him as King of Mundus. So he and Kyne assembled the Procreationists and attempted to overthrow Auriel. However, considering Hircine's modern circumstances as a Daedric Prince, clearly this plan did not work out. So what went wrong? Did the Procreationists lose the war? Well, no, I think that the truth is more complicated. I believe that Kyne and the rest of the Procreationists eventually found out the truth about Hircine, that he's just a fragment of Shezarr and mostly the Trickster part no less. And once the truth got out, they just kind of lost interest in fighting. I have two theories as to how Hircine's cover could have been blown. The first one involves another goddess, Mara. One peculiar thing about Mara is that cultures disagree about her love life. The Nordic belief is that Mara is the handmaiden of Kyne and the concubine of Shor, but other cultures claim that she is romantically involved with Akatosh. So what's the truth here? What are the natures of Mara's relationships with Akatosh and Lorkhan? Well, one thing that's always struck me as curious about the ancient Nordic depiction of Mara is that the animal associated with her is the wolf. It's a strange choice for the goddess of love, why not something like a butterfly or a rabbit? So what's the deal with the wolf? Well, wolves have a heavy association with Hircine, don't they? So maybe this is an instance of names for different Lorkhans getting mixed up, and Mara's relationship with Lorkhan is not with Shor, but rather with Hircine. So where am I going with this? Well, perhaps Mara wasn't really so much his concubine, but rather his mistress. As in, Hircine cheated on Kyne with Mara, her handmaiden, then Kyne found out and dumped him for it, and also fired Mara for her treachery. Mara would have been displaced and would have needed new allies, so she started a new romance with Akatosh. Thus, how we've ended up with claims that she's romantically involved with both Akatosh and Lorkhan. I'm not sold on this idea, but if true, it would have interesting implications on the war. Did Kyne stay alongside Hircine in the interest of exacting revenge on Auriel? Or could it be at this point she figured revenge for what, killing my cheating husband? Or did she know Shezarr well enough to realize, wait, he'd never cheat on me, so this must not really be him? Could be. However, I have another theory as to how Hircine's cover could have been blown that I like much better. And I suppose it's not mutually exclusive with the first idea, but nevertheless I like this one better. Varieties of Faith in the Empire claims that Soon died defending Shor, but considering our theory, it's likely that it was actually Hircine. Once Soon got to Sovngarde, he would have met Shor and discovered the truth, and he'd want to inform Kyne and the other Procreationists that they were being played. So is there a way that he could have gotten the message to them? The first thing that comes to mind is the portal, but there's no lore about the portal, so for all we know it could have always been under Alduin's control, or may not have even existed during the War of Manifest Metaphors. However, something else does come to mind that fits a lot better. When it's time for the last Dragonborn to return to Mundus, Soon uses a shout to send them there. And where do they end up? Atop the throat of the world, a place heavily associated with Kyne. Hence, the theory that I'm going with here is that Soon died defending Hircine, thinking that he was Shezarr, then in Sovngarde he found out the truth from Shor. Then one of them shouted the other to Mundus to tell Kyne that she was being deceived. The shout that Soon uses here, Nal Dal Vus, translates to living return Nern, so to send one of them it would be either Shor Dal Vus or Soon Dal Vus. But since they're dead, my guess is that the effect would be temporary for them, perhaps more like the Call of Valor shout. So once Kyne and the rest of the Procreationists learned the truth that they weren't really fighting for Shezarr, they stopped fighting, which is ultimately how the War of Manifest Metaphors ended. And Hircine was banished to oblivion, perhaps by Auriel or maybe by multiple gods. So that's the answer to the convention problem. It wasn't Shezarr that led the Procreationists in the war, it was Hircine. But this theory is not without issues. The major flaw here is that there are other ways to reconcile the convention problem, aren't there? We could also come up with some theories about one of the other Lorkhans leading the Procreationists. However, those would have flaws as well. Let's start with Shor. As I said before, we know that Shor exists and is somewhere in Sovngarde. So in his current state, what exactly is he capable of? There are legends that tell tales of Shor's ghost doing things in Mundus, such as Old Knocker and 5 Songs of King Wolfarth. The explanation that we have for how he can enter Mundus is that he can be sung into existence. So what's something in the games that one might describe as singing that could make sense of this? A shout. Remember before when we were talking about a shout that Soon and Shor could use to send each other back to Mundus? Well, here's another reason to think that exists. And this version of Shor being referred to as Shor's ghost supports the notion that it is kind of like the Call of Valor shout. It summons this spectral form of him. So assuming we're on the right track here, it doesn't sound like Shor actually leaving Sovngarde would be that simple. Nothing's ever really impossible in Elder Scrolls, which is part of the beauty of it. In the case of Shor, just because he can't leave Sovngarde now in his present form, that doesn't mean there's nothing he can do to change that. Think about when you first try to enter the Soul Cairn if you're not a vampire. It doesn't work at first, but if you do this necromancy thing or become a vampire, you gain the ability to enter. So what would Shor need to do to enter Mundus again at full capacity permanently? I think at the very least he would need a new body, and would perhaps need to go through some sort of magical metamorphosis as well. So I guess it's possible that Shor could have returned to Mundus to fight in the War of Manifest Metaphors, but I don't find it likely because he would have had to go through this huge rigmarole to do it. And he probably would have needed help from his allies, which he would not have had access to in Sovngarde. But what about Shezarrines? Perhaps the original Shezarrine is the Lorkhan that led the Procreationist war effort. However, that has flaws as well. Michael Kirkbride has provided a list of Lorkhan's avatars in the past, but remember, he is not the arbiter of the canon. Also, I'm not entirely sure that his avatars of Lorkhan are the same thing as our Shezarrines. I think we may be talking about 2 different things here, because Shezarrines aren't really avatars. Though, if this were by chance an accurate list of Shezarrines, it would disprove a Shezarrine leading the Procreationists, because he claims that the first one was Wolfarth, who didn't exist until long after all of this. But nevertheless, there just isn't sufficient reason to interpret this list that way. So why don't I think that a Shezarrine led the war effort? Well, as of yet, I haven't found anything that suggests that Shezarrines know that they are Shezarrines in life. And for us to end up with the claim that Lorkhan led the Procreationists, it seems logical that whatever Lorkhan is being referred to knew that they were some aspect of Shezarr. But the main reason I don't believe that Shor or a Shezarrine led the Procreationists is that I like the Hircine theory. So allow me to explain why I am convinced that Hircine is the answer to this mystery. As I said at the beginning, at first this was just a side idea that I figured wouldn't make the final cut. But the more I researched, the more things I found that fit with it. Things that really seemed like clues. And after much contemplation, I believe that Hircine is indeed the result of Kyne attempting to remake Shezarr, and that he is the Lorkhan that led the Procreationists in the War of Manifest Metaphors. I'll start by explaining how the Skyforge led me to this theory. Once I had a clear picture of what the Skyforge does and its association with Kyne, there was still a loose end. How does Hircine fit into all of this? When it comes to major quest lines like faction lines, Bethesda rarely acts without intent. So why have they chosen Hircine and Lycanthropy to play a prominent role in the Companions line? Naturally, I began by learning as much about Hircine as I could. I had already been reading a lot of the relevant sources because I knew that the War of Manifest Metaphors was important, so I had the differing accounts of how the Daedra came to be fresh in my mind. But when it comes to the individual origins of each prince, things get a lot harder because not all of them are original. We know that Malakath was Trinimac, an Aedra, and he got turned into a Daedra. Also, Sheogorath started as Jigalag. There are even claims that Mehrunes Dagon was created by the Magna Gi. So what about Hircine? Well, there's literally nothing about Hircine's origin in the lore. Even Varieties of Faith in the Empire makes no mention of him. The closest thing there is comes from an ESO source called Sage Svari Answers Your Questions, in which the author claims that she knows that lycanthropy existed in the early Merethic era, which would entail Hircine existing prior to that since he created lycanthropy. There are also ESO sources that suggest that he was an Atata, but I haven't found any actual claim that he was, and I don't put much stock in the Khajiit myths because they're very inconsistent with the other mythologies. So at this point in my research, I had determined that I could not confirm that Hircine existed prior to the Skyforge. As I continued researching, I found that experts often say something along the lines of the following. Some scholars believe that Hircine was not one of the original Daedric Princes, etc., which seems to come from Fandom's Hircine page. However, no one ever cites a primary source for that claim. So I'm inclined to think that quote-unquote some scholars are really fans, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. Like I said, I could not confirm that Hircine existed prior to the Skyforge, so I was strongly considering the possibility that he was not an original Daedric Prince, so I suppose I'm some scholar as well. I kept looking and I found another oddity when it comes to Hircine that actually dates back to Daggerfall. To do Daedric quests in that game, the player actually had to summon the princes through a service much like Guildhall services in Morrowind. Each one had what's called a summoning day, which is a day of the year in which the ritual will work. However, this rule does not apply to Hircine. He can be summoned any day, but only by the Glenmoral Witches. Though by cross-referencing each prince's summoning day with Daggerfall's version of Invocation of Azura and any version of 16 Accords of Madness Volume 6, we can conclude that Hircine does have a summoning day, which is the 5th of mid-year. But there's more. The book On Oblivion, another Daggerfall-era source, also treats Hircine differently than the other princes. Here the author is listing the princes, but omits Hircine. Then he brings Hircine up later and notes that he has never found anyone that can summon him. In this source, Bethesda chose to draw our attention to the fact that Hircine isn't summoned quite like the other princes, so I'm betting that this is important. We seem to have found a trend of Daggerfall-era sources treating Hircine differently than the other princes, which seems to suggest that there is something unique about Hircine, but what is it exactly? Well, there's one more prince that can override the Summoning Day rules, and that's Sheogorath. He has a slight chance of being summoned on any of the summoning days if there is a thunderstorm. So what could Hircine have in common with Sheogorath that could explain them both having exceptions to the Summoning Day rules? Well, we know that Sheogorath isn't exactly an original Daedric Prince, and we've already theorized that Hircine may not be either. So we might interpret this similarity that Hircine has with Sheogorath as a hint that he is also not an original Daedric Prince. There is a flaw here though. Malakath, who we pretty much know is not an original Daedric Prince, is not exempt to the Summoning Day rules. So tying Hircine to Sheogorath like this is a stretch. But despite that, there is still a clear trend of Bethesda treating Hircine differently than the other Daedric princes that dates back to Daggerfall. So at this point, I had some good reasons to believe that Hircine is not an original Daedric Prince, and that the Skyforge may have come into existence before he did. I contemplated this along with all the other information, and took another look at the Skyforge. The phoenix is nesting, which symbolizes how it renews the deceased into something new. I also examined the Underforge again, and thought about the relation between them. I had been struggling to understand their magical relationship, but then it occurred to me that they also have a physical relationship. They're divided by this floor, which is clearly man-made. If this barrier between the top and bottom weren't here, this whole thing would really look like a nest, wouldn't it? So I thought about this for a bit, then all the pieces clicked into place. Hircine was born here. This is where Kyne brought Shezarr's heartless torso, the Trickster, and the animal parts and renewed them into Hircine. Think about how Nord hero gear is made. It requires an old piece of ancient Nord gear, steel ingots, and leather strips. So, making a new piece of gear requires the substance and essence of an old piece of gear, and when that's not enough, the gaps are filled in with leather strips, which are made from animals. Why doesn't the bow need leather strips? Well, I think that's because the old bow and the steel are enough, there are no gaps. Also, from Bethesda's point of view, bows don't usually require leather strips, so if this one did, it would be a huge hint. Given how this process seems to work, let's think about what Kyne would have needed if she wanted to try to make a new Shezarr. She'd have needed some of the substance and some of the essence of Shezarr, like perhaps part of his body and a fragment of his soul. And if that wasn't enough, she'd have to fill in the blanks with animal parts. Hence, considering how the Skyforge works, it's very feasible that Kyne could have created Hircine from Shezarr's torso, animal parts, and the Trickster. But remember, she thought that she had Shezarr's entire soul. Furthermore, this passage from Songs of the Return Volume 7 makes a lot of sense with the theory we've built so far. The Snow Elves were brought to the birthplace of the being that led a legendary war campaign against their ancestors. So yeah, they were understandably very distraught. While we're here, there's something that's always struck fans wrong about how the Skyforge's crafting menu is set up that our theory can help explain. Why is ancient Nord armor categorized as Daedric? Also, it doesn't require a piece of old gear like the Nord hero weapons do. Why could this be? Well, I think that it's because Kyne doesn't hold the secret to crafting ancient Nord armor. Hircine does. and it's craftable because of something the Circle does in the Underforge. Think about Aella, she's the only member of the Circle that does wear it, and of all the members that survive to the point where Ancient Nord armor becomes craftable, she is the most loyal to Hircine. So is it a coincidence that the most pious Hircine worshipper in the group is the only one that brandishes Ancient Nord armor? Well, I don't think so. I think this is a clue. Also, the design has a resemblance to Savior's Hide, which is an artifact heavily associated with Hircine. So what is the Circle doing that's making the armor craftable? Well, Aella's pursuit of the totems of Hircine start around this time. So it could be that Bethesda's idea is really that the totems are what cause it to be craftable, but they didn't flag it with that because that would be too obvious of a clue. Or it could just be some other form of worship they do down here, who knows? But Hircine holding the secret to crafting this armor leads us to a question. Did the ancient Nords worship Hircine? I mean, what's he doing with the secret to crafting their armor? Did he perhaps have them conned thinking that he was Shor? That could very well be the case. They used the fox as Shor's animal avatar, and one of Hircine's aspects is Gulibeg the fox. So perhaps when the ancient Nords thought that Shor was presenting himself as a fox, it was really Hircine as Gulibeg. I'm not sold on this idea because if Kyne found out the truth, wouldn't she have passed that down to the Nords? Well, I suppose maybe she did, but somehow not all of them got the memo. Also, it's quite possible that this design is something that Hircine remembers from being Shezarr, and if that's the case, then Shor probably knows how to make it as well. So, since there's really no reason to believe that Hircine is the only being that knows how to make it, we cannot safely assume that the ancient Nords thought he was Shor. However, there is more to say about Gulibeg. In ESO, there's a quest called Symbol of Gulibeg, in which the player retrieves a wand that Gulibeg supposedly fashioned from a shard of Shezarr's ribs. So, how could an aspect of Hircine have ended up with one of Shezarr's ribs? Well, it would make sense if his torso was formerly Shezarr's torso and he simply took it from his own body, which really fits well with our theory. So why has Bethesda chosen Hircine for this role in the Companion's questline? Well, is it possible that Hircine has purposefully ensnared the Companions because he wants to use the Skyforge to make something? Absolutely, I believe this to be the case, and I think I know what Hircine's grand plan is. So buckle up. Here are the key pieces for this one. Once Kodlak is cured of lycanthropy, he talks about the heroes of Sovngarde potentially coming to rescue the other companions that are still under Hircine's curse. Afterward, if the player chooses to stay a werewolf, Aella will offer quests to retrieve some totems of Hircine, which are brought to the Underforge. And lastly, Shezarr's death is often referred to as the Shattering of Lorkhan. So how do these pieces fit together? Well, pay close attention to what Yorlin says when he presents Wulfrad to the player. The flames of a hero can reforge the shattered. So, I believe that Hircine's grand plan here is to ensnare the companions to lure Shor out of Sovngarde to save them. Then he hopes to capture Shor and use the Skyforge's magic to rebind the two of them together into a new Shezarr. And he wants the totems positioned in the Underforge because that will give him more power than Shor in this new Shezarr. So why does Hircine want to do that? Well, the obvious answer is power. But it's also the ultimate hunt, isn't it? I mean, to lure a god out of an unreachable realm to trap him and, in a way, consume him. If that's not a scheme befitting of the Daedric Prince of the Hunt, I don't know what is. But why would Hircine want to become Shezarr again? He seems to be happy being Hircine. Well, the only other thing I can think of is maybe he thinks that Kyne will take him back if he gets as close to being Shezarr as he can. There are some experts who interpret Hircine's theme of chase and pursuit as broader than just hunting. They think that he's also interested in the pursuit and seduction of lovers. So if that's true, then Hircine's probably not the type to give up on a romance easily. And he also could be the type to pursue multiple lovers. So maybe that's part of what's going on here. Maybe we're meant to view this love life that we theorized for Hircine as very characteristic of him. So folks, this grand plan of Hircine's is really what sold me on this theory. The clues fit together so well. The particular nature of what the magics of the Skyforge do. Yorlin saying that the flames of a hero can reforge the shattered, Hircine's torso always being depicted as the most humanoid part of his body, and always having animal parts where he doesn't have human parts, Kodlak's dialogue about saving the other companions. It all just adds up too perfectly to be a coincidence. It all comes together to form this beautiful plot that's perfect for this character, and it bleeds Bethesda's writing style. So yeah, this was planned by writers. But planned for what exactly? It seems way too elaborate to just be the answer to a mystery. So could this be the precursor to a plot in Elder Scrolls 6 involving Hircine? Well, I guess that's possible, but I actually have another theory. Really, this is part of a bigger theory that I have that I suppose is a potential future video. So when Skyrim launched back in 2011, I don't think that Bethesda had the plans for DLC set in stone, but I do think that they had some ideas. So they put potential plugs for DLC in the game for the ideas that they had, but only ended up using a few. So I think that this grand plan of Hircine's is one of those plugs. In fact, I believe that this is the original idea that ultimately became Dragonborn. I think that the idea to revisit Solstheim started as a much more direct Bloodmoon throwback, with Hircine as the antagonist again, and this grand plan of his with the Skyforge would have been the lead into it. So just for fun, here's an idea of how it would have started. Did you hear? The Skyforge, it flew away. All of a sudden it just woke up, snatched Jarlan Greymane and flew off. What will the companions do without Skyforge steel? This would initiate an objective to go investigate. Then once there, the companions would tell you that it flew off to the northeast, and they would ask you to track it down and rescue Yorland, which would take you to Solstheim where the whole expansion would take place. Do I really believe that was the plan? Well, it's hard to say because it's impossible to know how much of these original ideas for DLC actually came to fruition. Did they ever write scripts for this idea, or did they tweak it into Dragonborn very early on? So instead of thinking about this that way, let's just say that it's for fun. I came up with this by starting with our theory, then I just tried my best to mimic Bethesda's writing style. Their DLCs do frequently begin with rescue missions. Also, you might interpret the Skyforge flying to Solstheim as a nice homage to the Raven from Bloodmoon. So why did Bethesda choose to do Dragonborn instead of this idea? When you think about it, this Bloodmoon throwback would have been the perfect sequel to the main quest. However, I actually think that's a big part of why they didn't go for it. In Skyrim, Bethesda tried very hard to make it so the quest lines were non-sequential to each other, and this Bloodmoon throwback would have only really made sense if you had already been introduced to Sovngarde and its inhabitants from the main quest. Also, a huge part of Elder Scrolls is the mystique around the mythology, so they may have decided that this DLC would be too revealing. But you know, this all worked out because we ended up with Dragonborn, which is a terrific DLC. So that's it for the major narrative parts of this theory. Now let's talk about the rest of the evidence and thought processes I have for it that didn't really have a logical place in the narrative. There really are a lot of things that support this theory. Hircine's influence in Mundus is at its peak during Blood Moons, but think for a second about what a Blood Moon is in the Elder Scrolls universe. It's when Secunda, part of Shezarr's body, turns red. This could very well symbolize Hircine being a corruption of Shezarr. Speaking of the moons, there's not one, not five, there's specifically two. So what does that mean? Well, Shezarr is sometimes described as unstable and incomplete. But what makes him that way? Well, maybe this refers to how being both the warrior and the trickster made him chaotic, and maybe his body ending up as specifically two moons is a hint for how when he split into two gods he became complete in a way. Being shattered stabilized him. Which can also explain why just one of them turns red during blood moons, because Hircine is just one of the two gods. Also, this notion of Shezarr being both the trickster and the warrior really shines upon one particular account of Shezarr's creation, that Padome created him for the purpose of introducing instability to the Arbus. What better way to create instability than to combine two very different traits in the same being? So could be that this origin story for Shezarr is correct and Padome has been the mastermind of Elder Scrolls all along. While on the subject of the moons, there is something we must address. Some experts, such as the Fudge Muppet team, are critical of the Lunar Lorkhan theory because this text was written by Faldrune, whose name is an anagram for Dark Fool. This anagram is definitely intentional, but that doesn't mean that everything he writes is wrong. Bethesda chose to make this easy to discern. It's an 8-letter anagram. If this were a hint for one single interpretation of Faldrun's name, I'm inclined to think that they would have made it something more complicated than this. Since they chose to make this easy, I think that they wanted us to find this quickly and for us to debate different interpretations of it. So here's my interpretation of Faldrun's name. Throughout history, many people that we see as geniuses now were heavily scrutinized at first. Socrates was executed for being smart. When Larry David pitched Seinfeld, no one ever thought it would become as popular as it did. Heck, people thought I was crazy when I told them that I was going to try to make a career out of producing videos about Fallout and Elder Scrolls. In the historic examples of this often happens because the given person is ahead of their time. So I believe that Faldrun is one of these people in Elder Scrolls. I mean, his other publication, the Dragonbreak Reexamined, seemingly came to Morrowind from the future, which has a further meaning in the book because it's an explanation of a historical error of timing. So it's a book about an error of timing that came from the future. So yeah, this other publication has me convinced that Faldrun's name being an anagram for Darn Fool is a play on how he's ahead of his time. But that also doesn't mean that everything he writes is correct. So I'm going with he's right about some of his theories, but doesn't have a complete picture. Also, in the case of the Lunar Lorkhan, we have to consider the fact that it's an alteration skill book. And Bethesda's rule for those is that there always has to be justification for the given book enhancing a skill. So why does this book enhance alteration? Well, perhaps the moons started as Shezarr's body, but changed into what they are now via some sort of alteration magic. I won't go too deep into this because it doesn't matter for our purposes, but I believe that the agent of this change was Azura. So in summary, even if the moons are not literally Shezarr's body, I think that they are tied to him in some way. Even the Khajiit, who have a very unique take on the moons, agree that they are related to Shezarr. ESO has expanded upon Khajiit mythology quite a lot, and there's a few details I'd like to discuss. I don't put much stock in their myths because they're very inconsistent with the commonly shared aspects of the monomyth that most Tamrielic cultures share. Nevertheless, they are worth discussing. So let's discuss a few details. Khajiit myths tell of a goddess named Nirni. She's a personification of the planet Nirn, and Hircine is said to have been in love with her. Some even believe that he is the father of her first litter. Nirni is associated with nature, given that she is the planet Nirn, but she also is heavily associated with motherhood, which is apparent in the stories about her. So it's possible that Nirni is actually a combination of Mara and Kyne, or Canarfi as the Khajiit call her, which would make sense with our theories about Hircine's love life. Also, we know that Hircine is tied to the moons somehow, and the moons are extremely important to the Khajiit religion. They call them the Twin Lanterns. Masser is Jode, the Lantern of Love, and Secunda is Joan, the Lantern of Mercy. So why is this important? Well, there's a Daedric artifact that's strongly associated with Hircine called the Spear of Bitter Mercy. So this doesn't really add much to our theory, but it further supports the notion that Hircine is tied to the moons, and henceforth also Shezarr. It's also important to note that he seems to have a stronger connection to Secunda than Masser, since that's the Lantern of Mercy and that's the one that turns red during the Bloodmoon prophecy. While we're on the subject of the moons, we should talk about their names. In French, Masser means to gather or combine. It's the French version of mass, as in to mass troops. Secunda comes from Latin but is used in French, and it roughly means the second. It's associated with both seconds as in the increments of time and also variants of the number 2. So we could interpret the names of the moons as combine 2, and that fits very well with something in our theory, doesn't it? Padome combining Trickster and Warrior in one being. It also fits very well with something in Khajiit mythology. When Masser and Secunda both eclipse the sun, they reveal something that the Khajiit call the Dark Moon. So to do this, the two moons have to be masked a certain way. I also like the notion of this third moon because it creates a moon for Shezarr. If we assume that we're on the right track with Secunda representing Hircine, then it seems logical that Masser represents Shore. And if the Dark Moon really is a third moon, then that would probably represent Shezarr, which is very fitting for our theory, since Masser and Secunda need to overlap, or in a way combine, in order to reveal the third moon. It seems very symbolic of the traits of Trickster and Warrior being combined to form Shezarr. Also, remember before when we were talking about the totems and I said that Hircine needs them to give him more power than Shore in this new Shezarr? Well, the most common meaning of the word Secunda seems to be that it's an inferior second, as in after the first. And Secunda is a lot smaller than Massor, isn't it? So this could be meant to tell us that Shore is more powerful than Hircine, which would support the notion that Hircine needs the totems to overpower Shore. But we could also interpret this to mean that Shezarr had more warrior than Trickster in him, which would also be fitting because Hircine has this sense of honor, which could be explained by the Trickster and warrior traits not exactly being an even split. I mean, I suppose those two things aren't mutually exclusive with each other. So let's just assume that Hircine needs the totems for something involving rebinding himself to Shore. However, there's something we must address. We've established that Shezarr had these two competing personalities, and that he eventually split into these two gods, and that these divine beings each have a moon that represents them. But what about Shezarrines? Doesn't their existence entail that there must be a third personality, and also a fourth moon? Well, no, Shezarrines seem to be small fragments of both the Trickster and Warrior. Let's revisit Kirkbride's list. Remember, we're not certain that this really is a list of Shezarrines, though I think some of the people on this list certainly are, but there's no way that this is all of them because he's missing a few commonly accepted ones. Also, on a side note, I sincerely hope that Martin Septim is not a Shezarrine, because that would ruin him being the everyman. Back on topic, let's think about some characters that we're fairly certain are Shezarrines. Take Tiber Septim, for instance. He was a terrific warrior, but also a very clever man. The same could be said for Pelennor Whitestrake. I mean, think about the last Dragonborn. He, she, or they saves Mundus by defeating Alduin, but also is a master thief, and depending on choice can be a master assassin, though let's be real, how many of us really choose not to do the Dark Brotherhood questline? So the point here is that Shezarrines seem to have traits of both warrior and trickster in them. So rather than there being another personality, it seems like they just have small bits of the two. And why don't they have a moon? Well, because they're not gods. As the Yakudan myth Sadakal the World Skin sort of describes them, they're like an empty skin. They're Shezarr reduced to mortality. So unfortunately for them, they don't get a moon. Another thing that really fits well with Shezarr having these two competing personalities in him is Hircine's famous creation, lycanthropy. At the end of the companion's questline, the player cures lycanthropy by separating the subject's soul from their wolf spirit. It's also cured by similar means in Morrowind's Bloodmoon DLC. Hence, lycanthropy seems to be a conjunction of two souls, a person and an animal. So could it be that Hircine's inspiration for lycanthropy is his former state of being as part of Shezarr? Two interlocked things that don't function together well? I think that's very likely. This notion also has an interesting element on the physical side of things. Lycanthropy seems to be an insult to Kyne. I mean, it's combining an animal with a person. And if we're right about this, it's also creating an abomination based on her husband. So maybe part of Hircine's motivation for creating lycanthropy was that he wanted to hurt Kyne. Could be that he was bitter about the breakup. Additionally, perhaps this notion that being Shezarr was something like having lycanthropy can help us understand his motivation for creating Mundus. How do the minds of lycanthropes work? The Circle seems to control their lycanthropy very well, which may be due to their relationship with Hircine, though Kodlak does acknowledge that it seeps into their spirits. And from other cases of lycanthropy, we know that the beast can overtake the person. So if we are on the right track here, this seems to suggest that Shezarr was indeed unstable, and this instability complicates the question. Did the idea to create Mundus come from the warrior or the trickster? Or did they both want it for different reasons? Perhaps the warrior intended it as a testing ground and the trickster intended it as, well, a hunting ground. How wild would that be if the precursor to Hircine wanted to create Mundus to hunt the other Atata? Now let's talk more about Hircine as the trickster god. Think about Hircine's theme. He's a perversion and exploitation of nature. He lives for the act of pursuit and having mortal subjects compete in hunting competitions. Well, what is hunting? A big part of it is outsmarting prey. That's very reminiscent of a trickster character, isn't it? So let's summarize these key elements of Hircine's theme. Hircine seems to be a dark side of what Kyne stands for, which is consistent with our theory because he likely adopted this theme out of spite for her over their breakup. It's also very fitting on an artistic level because it makes it so Kyne's biggest mistake is also nature's greatest enemy. And in addition to that, he also seems to have Shezarr's trickster traits. So all in all, the character that Hircine is very fitting for the origin story that we theorized for him. Now that we've reached this point, there's something I'd like to address. If you've seen any of Fudge Muppet's videos about Hircine, you may have noted that I disagree with some of their takes. And that's no slight to them, they've certainly been doing this a lot longer than I have and I really enjoy their content. But I disagree with some of their takes on Hircine. One key thing that we differ on is this notion of Hircine as a trickster. When Drew, who's now Drew Mora, was still part of Fudge Muppet, he narrated a video called Hircine the Fairest of Them All, which I'll tag in the top right there. And that video really asserts that Hircine is not a trickster. However, I disagree with that interpretation. I agree that Hircine puts a strong emphasis on fairness, but fairness is not necessarily the absence of dishonesty. It's simply the impartial treatment of all the given participants. Consider a game of cards, if you will. Many card games involve trickery. But so long as the cards were shuffled and everyone's following the rules, you'd still say that the game is fair, wouldn't you? So when Hircine's playing his games, from his point of view, as long as he and whoever he's interacting with all have the same opportunity to trick one another, the game is fair. Also, he doesn't necessarily see himself as one of the participants. During the Bloodmoon prophecy, facing him was really the prize for whatever mortal won. For him, these games are like a game show with him as the host. So in summary, I don't think that Hircine has an issue with trickery. Like I said before, trickery is a huge part of hunting, which is his main theme. But let's think about him outside of these games he orchestrates. Really, Hircine is one of the hardest, if not the hardest, prince to read because we mainly interact with him in these competitions. And how someone acts during a game is not a good basis for how they act in general. It's also hard to tell how powerful Hircine is because he always fights in a scaled form. So is there anything that can give us a glimpse of what Hircine is like in general rather than when he's hosting games? Well, yes, the best sources that we have for that are the cutscenes from the Bloodmoon DLC. And from those we can see that when outcomes do matter, he does think and act objectively, and he does get frustrated when things don't go his way. With this notion of fairness and what Hircine's like in general rather than just in the games, let's revisit the part of our theory when the Trickster spirit tricks Kyne into remaking him as Hircine. Does he really care that he's stretching the truth a little bit here? No. This isn't a game, he is impacted by the outcome. Also, he may not even see this as a lie. Maybe he does really believe that he is the part of Shezarr that she loved. And that would make the spite he feels for her over the breakup make a lot of sense. Because in this scenario, he really does believe that he is the closest being to Shezarr that there is, therefore he has inherited their marriage vows. Which he broke when he cheated on her with Mara, if we're right about that. But even so, cheaters rarely think rationally. So in summary, this character analysis of Hircine seems consistent with the narrative we've devised. Now let's look at some lore. There's a line from the Altmeri Heart of the World story from the monomyth I'd like to discuss. This source goes into more detail on Lorkhan's military campaign than the other sources do, and this line describes Auriel's forces being driven out of Atmora. They were chased south and east to Old Elnathay, and Lorkhan was close behind. This bloodthirsty campaign is very characteristic of Hircine. He lives for tracking down and cornering prey like this. So this could very well be an instance of the term Lorkhan really referring to Hircine. Though it's important to note that this source is a biased one, since Elven mythology tries very hard to assert Lorkhan and humans as evil. But we know that there is some truth to this source because Auriel's bow and shield exist. Furthermore, there's another detail here that has me convinced that we are indeed talking about Hircine here. They were chased. One key detail I've noted in my extended research about Hircine is that the word chase comes up a lot. So, not only is this behavior very characteristic of Hircine, the exact wording is also very consistent with how lore about Hircine tends to be worded. Now let's talk about a particular group of Hircine's followers, the Reachmen. It's really fascinating how little information Bethesda actually gives us about the Reachmen in the base games. Luckily for us, ESO has expanded upon them quite a lot. The improved Emperor's Guide to Tamriel, Northern Bankerai, and the Mountains confirms something that fans have long suspected about the Reachmen. While not all clans follow the exact same religion, they consistently hold Hircine in high regard. In fact, he seems to be their chief deity. These pieced-together skeletons one can find in their camps seem to represent Hircine's theme, the perversion of nature. I looked at these camps in detail, and of course I started by clearing out the Forsworn. And when I was bringing a Briarheart down, a light bulb went off in my head. Think about what a Briarheart is. Their hearts are ripped out and replaced with something else, then they are resurrected. That sounds an awful lot like something in our theory, doesn't it? Shezarr having his heart ripped out, then his heartless torso, and the Trickster being combined with some new parts and resurrected as Hircine. I followed up on this lead and found more. In another ESO source, Great Spirits of the Reach Volume 5, the author says their research indicates that Briarhearts were indeed inspired by Lork, the Reachmen depiction of Lorkhan. And it gets better. Another passage from the source we were looking at before says that the key to surviving the Briarheart ritual is communion with Hircine, not Lork, not Shore, Hircine. So, the creation of Briarhearts was inspired by Lork, yet Hircine is the key to creating them? How could that be? Well folks, I think that Lork is Shezarr, the pre-convention Lorkhan that lost his heart, and Hircine is the key to creating Briarhearts now because he is a resurrected Lork. He's just guiding them through a process very similar to his own creation. So this information about Briarhearts and the Reachmen supports our theory a whole lot, doesn't it? Also, considering that these are both secondary sources, it's very feasible that the authors might have been confused about the distinction between Lork and Hircine, and that's why they never connected the dots to form Hircine's origin story. So all this information has very interesting implications. Could it be that the reason Bethesda has always been so quiet in regards to the Reachmen's religion is because they know some of the truth about Hircine's origin, and perhaps more secrets about Elder Scrolls mythology as well? And where did this affinity for Hircine come from? Well, the Reachmen have a very mixed pedigree, but they are humans, so they are descendants of the Wandering Elnathay, and really their culture is very reminiscent of how the Wandering Elnathay lived. So could it be that the modern Elder Scrolls Reachmen are a lineage that has remained loyal to Hircine since the War of Manifest Metaphors? All things considered, it's very possible, and that would be incredible. Over 5,000 years of service to Hircine. There's more to be said about Shezarr's torso as well. This statue is to the left of where the Nerevarine spawns just before facing Karstag in the Bloodmoon questline. This is a one-of-a-kind asset. I looked all over for another one, but this is the only one. It may just look like a pair of legs at first, but upon close examination, it pretty clearly depicts Hircine's aspect of guile, which aspects of Lord Hircine later names Alrabeg. But really back when this was new in the early 2000s, this was just the asset that Bethesda used to represent Hircine. So this is Hircine in what would have been considered his main form back then. But something's not right here, huh? The statue is missing some parts, including a huge chunk of the torso. So, Bethesda dedicated time and resources into making this asset, yet they only placed it in the game once. And they made sure that a huge chunk was missing, starting at the torso area. Why do all that? It's too much trouble to go to for something that's only going into the game once that most players will never even look at. Unless there's hidden meaning. Hence, I think that this is meant to draw our attention to Hircine's torso. Furthermore, let's examine Skyrim's asset for Hircine's altars. This design appears to depict a skeletal torso, doesn't it? Also, if you look at this whole thing, it really looks like a casket. So, why would Bethesda choose to design Hircine's altars this way? Well, I believe this is a clue. They represent Shezarr's dead torso, which Kyne made use of to create Hircine. So, in addition to Briarhearts, there are two examples of assets relevant to Hircine that seemingly are designed to draw our attention to the torso area. Now let's discuss Hircine's quest in Skyrim, Ill Met by Moonlight. After getting this quest in Falkreath, the player must find Hircine's aspect of Beg, the Great Stag, which always spawns at this pool of water just off the road near Pinewatch. Just a tad upstream from here, there's a small bandit camp called Pinewatch Heights. And look what we can find in this tent, a copy of the Lunar Lorkhan. We've talked about a lot of books in this video, but if I were planning to place one somewhere in the game as a hint for the connection between Hircine, Lorkhan, and the moons, this is certainly the one I would pick. Also, let's think about this symbolically for a minute. Streams are often used as allegories for time, so if we apply that here, we might interpret this stream as a timeline. This copy of the Lunar Lorkhan could symbolize starting out as Shezarr, and further down the stream where Hircine's aspect is could symbolize later ending up as Hircine. Later in this quest, the player must track Sinding down to Bloated Man's Grotto. However, this dungeon is different than it normally is while this objective is active. One difference is that the Shrine of Talos will be missing. So why is this significant? Well, Tiber Septim is commonly believed to have been a Shezarrine. So could it be that Hircine got rid of the shrine because he didn't want to look upon another fragment of Shezarr? I don't doubt that there is meaning here, but I'm honestly not sure what direction to go in, so if you have any input, please comment. Another thing that will be different while this quest is active is the moons. At first glance, it just looks like Hircine is hosting another Bloodmoon competition. However, can you spot an issue with that? That there is Masser, and blood moons are historically Secunda. So this is pretty different from the blood moon we saw in Morrowind. That one was crimson, but these really aren't much darker than they usually are. So I think what's going on with the sky here is a clue. Masser is positioned so that it creates a nice aesthetic view when confronting Sinding. And there's this red mist everywhere. Remember when we talked about how the stream could resemble time? Well, I think a very similar concept applies here. When the player proceeds into the dungeon, the first moon that they'll come across is Masser, which is behind Sinding. However, if this were just an aesthetic shot for the Hircine quest, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to use Secunda here? Really, that's the moon that seems to be more affiliated with Hircine and his were-creatures. So maybe that's not the idea here. Perhaps the idea is that Masser represents shore. And what is Sinding? Well, he's the prey, isn't he? And what happens after this? Regardless of what choice the player makes, they end up chasing Sinding to the end of the dungeon. And this is where the quest concludes. So what's the hidden meaning here? Well, I think this symbolizes Hircine's grand plan that we discussed earlier. The prey is in front of Masser because shore is Hircine's prey. He starts out up high and passes through a ruined structure, then exits down the stairs on the other side into the woods. So sort of like shore descending out of Sovngarde into Mundus? He continues running until he's cornered, which represents being captured by Hircine. So yeah, I'm thinking that this sequence is a hint for Hircine's grand plan to lure Shore out of Sovngarde and rebinds the two of them together. Another thing we must discuss about this quest is this line that Hircine says when he gives the player Savior's Hide.
Look more closely at it. My glory shall protect you from all this world's grievances.
That's an awfully curious thing for the Daedric Prince of the Huns to say, isn't it? What does he care about the world's grievances? He phrases it universally, but I find it more likely that he has particular grievances in mind. Let's examine the Savior's Hide. Its exact enchantments vary by game, but it always offers some magic resistance. So why is this significant? Well, think about when magic resistance is useful. It's essentially defense against mages. And most hostile mages that players come across when exploring the wilderness are elves. So how does this tie in with that line of Hircine's? Well, I think these grievances that he's referring to are the grievances that many elves still hold against humankind because they are descendants of the wandering Elnathay. And why would Hircine give someone a cuirass specifically crafted to protect them from those particular grievances? Perhaps it's because of his role in those grievances as the real leader of the Procreationists. Now let's take a closer look at Morrowind's Bloodmoon DLC. The premise of this questline is that Hircine holds this hunting competition once in a while, and the Skull have prophesied that one will take place on Solstheim. Sure enough, that prophecy comes to fruition and the player ends up participating. However, there's an important detail about the Bloodmoon prophecy that many fans gloss over. Hircine holds this competition once every era. So why is this important? Well, in Elder Scrolls, eras are not a fixed amount of time. They begin and end in correspondence with key events. For example, the first era ends when Raymond III was assassinated. So, if Hircine holds this competition once each era, then doesn't that entail that he knows when each era will begin and end? How could he know that? Well, that's the kind of thing that Shezarr, the pioneer of the mortal plane, might know, isn't it? So this makes sense with our theory. To further support this notion, let's look into the other god that split from Shezarr, Shore. Here in this dialogue, Soon suggests that Shor does have some capacity to see the future. So, if Shor sometimes has visions of events to come, then it seems likely that Hircine does too, which could explain how he knows when each era will start and end. Maybe he saw Martin Septim sacrifice himself, so he thought, oh, I've got to fit one in before that happens. And maybe he knows when we're finally going to play Elder Scrolls 6. Well folks, after all that, it is time to conclude. That's why I believe that Hircine's true origin is that he was originally part of Shezarr, and after he was shattered, he tricked Kyne into recreating him. Then he led the Procreationists in the War of Manifest Metaphors. His cover was blown and he was banished to Oblivion, where he crafted his plane, the Hunting Grounds, and embraced life as Hircine, Daedric Prince of the Hunt. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe, like, and share if you enjoyed this video. Also, please comment with any thoughts about all this. Are you convinced by what I presented here, or do you think I've been Sheogorath-kissed? Let me know below, or if you want to have a longer discussion about this, we can do that in the Discord. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.